The Pentagon filed a 52-page classified report on a single special operations operation conducted in Afghanistan. The operation itself lasted 11 hours from insertion to extraction, 52 pages of detailed analysis for 11 hours of tactical action. This is significant. Military reports typically run at approximately 1 page per 4 to 5 hours of operation. This report ran at approximately 1 page per 15 minutes of operation. The level of analysis was extraordinary, and page 12 was classified at a level that meant only 12 people in the entire American military had authorization to read it. Only 12 people in an institution with more than 2 million active duty and reserve personnel. Only 12 people had authorization to read page 12 of the Pentagon's classified report on this operation. This is the story of what was on page 12, and more importantly, why someone felt it was necessary to classify a single page at a level higher than the rest of the document, at a classification level that exceeded the classification of everything else in the report. The operation took place on a Tuesday night in October 2008, in the Helmand province of Afghanistan, in a district that had become a Taliban stronghold. It was a collaborative operation. British Special Forces personnel trained and designated for direct action missions. American Special Forces personnel trained in the same direct action protocols. American Apache gunships providing close air support. American Chinook helicopters providing transport. American intelligence collection apparatus providing real-time information during the operation. Are all working together in a region where the distinction between British responsibility for security and American responsibility for security have become almost meaningless. Both nations were contributing personnel. Both nations were contributing assets. Both nations had skin in the game. The intelligence that drove the operation came from multiple sources. Human intelligence from local contacts who had provided information about Taliban movements and Taliban leadership in the area. Signals intelligence from collection platforms that monitored radio communications in the region. Communications intercepts. Pattern analysis of insurgent movements. Electronic signatures that suggested Taliban operational planning. All of it pointed to a single location, a compound approximately 12 kilometers north of the provincial capital of Lashkar-Gah, in a village where intelligence analysts believed Taliban cell leadership frequently gathered. In that compound, according to the assessments made by military intelligence officers in Kandahar and military intelligence officers in Bagram Air Base, were the leadership elements of a Taliban cell network that had been responsible for a campaign of attacks on Afghan government installations in the province and on British military forces operating in the region. The network had conducted at least 4 attacks in the previous 3 months. One attack had killed 2 Afghan police officers. One attack had wounded 3 British soldiers. The network was assessed as being a priority target. What made this cell network significant was not just its operational capability, but its operational sophistication. The Taliban, in 2008, was becoming more organized. The early years of the conflict had seen largely sporadic insurgent activity, cells operating independently with minimal coordination. By 2008, the Taliban had begun to establish more formal command structures. They had begun to develop more sophisticated operational planning. They had begun to employ tactics that showed evidence of military training and experience. This particular cell network was at the leading edge of that development. They had conducted reconnaissance of British military installations. They had planned coordinated attacks. They had established secure communication networks using commercial radio equipment modified with frequency hopping protocols. The operation that was planned to target this network was designated Operation Exalt. It was planned by officers at the task force designation that served as the command element for special operations in the regional area. The plan itself was deceptively simple: helicopter insertion of 2 teams of operators. The first team would fast rope onto the roof of the main building in the compound. The second team would establish a blocking position on the south exit to prevent personnel from escaping that direction. American Apache gunships would provide close air support and would be positioned to engage any vehicles attempting to leave the compound after the assault began. The entire operation was planned for execution in darkness, with night vision equipment providing the only light source for the operators on the ground. What was not in the public versions of the operational plan, what appeared only in the classified documents that the Pentagon would later file, was something that one of the planning officers had suggested in the last planning session before the operation launched. This planning officer was a major assigned to the task force, as a staff officer and liaison with intelligence elements. He had spent 3 years in Afghanistan across multiple tours. He had conducted approximately 43 direct action operations, either as an operator or as part of the planning team. He had a reputation for tactical precision and for thinking carefully about the strategic implications of tactical decisions. He was not the sort of officer who questioned every plan. He was not the sort of officer who reflexively argued against operations. But in the final planning session, he raised what he called a tactical question about target engagement protocols. He asked, specifically, whether the rules of engagement that had been issued for the operation allowed for engagement of personnel found in the compound without a positive identification of hostile intent, without clear evidence that the person being engaged had committed a hostile act or represented an immediate threat. This question, which seems on its surface to be a routine clarification about rules of engagement, became the central issue addressed in the Pentagon's classified report. The answer provided by the task force commanding officer was that personnel encountered in the compound during the assault would be engaged based on the assumption that their presence in a compound identified as hostile was itself evidence of hostile intent. This was not unprecedented. This was standard counterinsurgency doctrine. This was the way that tactical operations were conducted throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. If you entered a compound that had been designated as a hostile location, personnel in that compound would be engaged unless they clearly presented no threat to the assault force. That meant laying down weapons. That meant presenting empty hands. That meant complying with shouted commands to get on the ground. The operation launched at 21:47 hours local time on the Tuesday evening. The helicopters approached the compound from the west, flying low level to avoid detection by any radar system or visual observers who might be watching for approaching aircraft. Flying low level is a high-risk maneuver in populated areas. Every light source, every movement could indicate someone preparing to fire on the approaching aircraft, but low-level flight reduces the detection time. If radar systems are operating in the area, they have less time to acquire the target. If human observers are watching, the helicopters are below the horizon until the moment they appear over the target. The first team of operators, approximately 8 to 10 personnel, fast roped onto the roof of the main building in the compound and immediately encountered 3 individuals who were positioned as rooftop sentries. The engagement was immediate. There was no conversation. There was no shouted command to drop weapons. All 3 sentries were engaged and killed with precision fire. The assault team then moved through the building systematically, clearing rooms. They moved from room to room, using standard direct action clearing protocols, stun grenades to disorient anyone in rooms before entry, flashlights to identify targets, muzzle discipline to ensure that fire was concentrated on threats. They encountered additional personnel in the main room on the ground floor, a large room that appeared to be some form of meeting space or gathering area. This room contained 8 individuals. 3 of them were armed. 3 of them were holding weapons. 5 of them were not armed. 5 of them were unarmed individuals. All 8 individuals in the room were engaged. All 8 were killed. The assault team moved through the room, assessing each individual, determining threat status based on what each individual was holding or what each individual appeared to be reaching toward. The blocking team on the south side of the compound encountered a vehicle attempting to exit the compound perimeter. The vehicle appeared to be accelerating away from the compound area. The vehicle was fired upon by the blocking team. It crashed approximately 50 meters from the compound exit. 2 personnel emerged from the vehicle. Both appeared to be moving toward potential weapons or defensive positions. Both were engaged. Both were killed. By 22:13 hours, the assault was complete. The compound had been fully cleared. No coalition personnel casualties had been sustained. No coalition personnel had been wounded. 13 personnel had been killed during the assault. 2 were armed when engaged. 11 were not armed. The assault force withdrew by helicopter. The operation was declared successful. What happened after the operation, however, was what generated the 52-page classified report. Within 72 hours, intelligence reports began to arrive that suggested the composition of the individuals in the compound was not what the intelligence assessment had predicted. In particular, reports began to arrive suggesting that some of the individuals killed in the compound may have been civilians or persons not directly associated with the Taliban cell network. Some reports indicated the presence of family members of Taliban fighters. Some reports indicated individuals whose primary occupation was something other than insurgency. By 1 week after the operation, the assessment had become complex enough that the task force commanding general requested requested a formal review of the operation. This formal review became the 52-page Pentagon report. The report examined the intelligence that had been used to designate the compound as a hostile target. The report examined the planning process. The report examined the execution of the assault. The report examined the post-operation assessment. And what the report found was that the intelligence concerning the location of the Taliban cell leadership had not been incorrect, but it had been incomplete. The compound had been an operational base for elements of the cell network, but it had also been a residential location for families associated with those elements. The intelligence assessment had identified approximately 6 individuals whose operational roles were clearly established. These 6 individuals were confirmed to be in the compound at the time of the assault. All 6 were killed. The intelligence assessment had not identified the presence of family members in the compound. The pre-operation intelligence had focused on the compound as an operational location. The intelligence had not included information about civilian dependents who might be present. This is the critical distinction that appears in the classified sections of the report. The operation was conducted against what was accurately identified as a hostile location, but the presence of civilians in that location had not been predicted by the intelligence assessments. This created a situation where personnel were engaged based on the assumption of hostile intent that would have been violated had the pre-operation intelligence included information about the presence of non-combatants. The Pentagon report addressed this directly. It noted that the assault team, upon clearing each room, made engagement decisions based on the immediate threat presented by armed personnel. The report noted that non-armed personnel in a compound designated as hostile were engaged under the assumption that their presence in the compound indicated hostile intent or support for hostile activity. The report noted that this was consistent with rules of engagement that had been established for counterinsurgency operations. The report also noted that the final count of casualties suggested that 5 individuals, possibly 6, were likely non-combatant dependents of the cell network members. The report was careful to say likely because identification after death, in the absence of biometric data or prior intelligence records, was difficult. What was on page 12 of the classified report was not the question of whether civilians had been present in the compound. That was acknowledged throughout the classified sections of the document, and it was a matter of significant concern to the analysts reviewing the operation. What was on page 12 was something more specific, something more fraught with implication. Page 12 addressed the question of whether the assault team, during the clearing operation, had made a conscious decision to engage all personnel encountered in the compound, regardless of whether those personnel presented a direct threat to the assault team. The report documented with unusual specificity what had occurred at one point during the clearing of the ground floor room. The assault team entered the room and encountered 4 individuals sitting in the corner of the room with their hands raised above their heads. These 4 individuals were not armed. These 4 individuals were not reaching toward weapons. These 4 individuals had their hands elevated in what appeared to be a surrender posture. The assault team, according to the assault team members' own statements when interviewed following the operation, engaged all 4 individuals. All 4 were killed. When interviewed later, the assault team members explained their actions. They said they could not determine from their tactical position in the room whether the individuals sitting with hands raised might have access to concealed weapons hidden in clothing or positioned nearby. They said they could not determine whether the raised hands represented genuine surrender or whether the individuals might suddenly move toward weapons positioned elsewhere in the room. They said they could not determine the hostile intent of the individuals. They said they engaged based on force protection protocols that prioritize the safety of the assault force above all other considerations. Force protection is the military doctrine that emphasizes that the primary obligation of assault personnel is to ensure that they and their teammates survive the operation. Everything else in force protection doctrine is secondary to that obligation. The Pentagon report noted that this engagement was justified under the rules of engagement that had been provided for the operation. The rules of engagement stated that personnel in a hostile location who could not be confirmed as non-combatant could be engaged if they presented a potential threat to coalition forces. The report noted that a person sitting with raised hands could potentially move toward weapons or could potentially detonate a concealed explosive device. Therefore, under the rules of engagement, the engagement was justified. This conclusion appeared to satisfy the Pentagon's legal review of the operation. The operation was found to be in compliance with applicable rules of engagement and international humanitarian law. But what was classified at page 12 was something different. What was classified at page 12 was an assessment of whether the targeting of the compound itself had been based on intelligence that would have met a higher standard of verification. What was classified was a finding that the intelligence concerning the presence of Taliban leadership in the compound was based largely on a single source, a human intelligence asset who had provided information about Taliban movements in the area, and that this intelligence had not been corroborated by independent sources. What was classified was a finding that the signal's intelligence that had been used to support the targeting of the compound was indirect intelligence. The signal's intelligence showed radio traffic that was consistent with Taliban command communications, but it did not provide positive identification of specific individuals in the compound at the time of the assault. What was classified was a recognition that the targeting of the compound had been based on a probability assessment rather than a definitive identification. The intelligence assessments had concluded that the compound was likely to contain Taliban leadership elements. The word likely is important. It does not mean certain. It means probably with less than absolute certainty. The operation had been conducted against a target that was assessed as probably being a hostile location. The operation had been executed with rules of engagement that permitted engagement of personnel without a positive identification of hostile intent. The result had been the death of individuals who may not have been hostile. This is what the Pentagon, in the classified sections of its report, was attempting to address. The operation was legal under existing rules of engagement. The intelligence assessment had not been unreasonable, given the information available at the time of planning. The execution of the assault had been professional and competent, but the combination of probabilistic targeting, incomplete intelligence, and expansive rules of engagement had resulted in outcomes that included the death of individuals whose hostile status was uncertain. The classified pages of the report were attempting to answer the question of whether this combination of factors represented a problem that needed to be corrected. What the Pentagon ultimately concluded, according to the classified sections of the report, was that the operation had been conducted appropriately given the information available at the time. However, the report recommended that future operations of this type should include pre-operation verification that civilian dependents were not present in the target compound. The report recommended that intelligence collection efforts in support of targeting decisions should include efforts to identify non-combatant populations in the vicinity of targets. The report recommended that where uncertainty existed about the civilian status of personnel in a target location, the rules of engagement should be modified to require additional verification before engagement. These recommendations, which were addressed specifically in the classified sections of the Pentagon report, represented a significant shift in counterinsurgency doctrine. They represented an acknowledgement that the operational model that had been employed, attack the target, assess the outcome afterward, could be modified to include additional precautions for civilian protection. They represented an acknowledgement that the previous standard, which permitted engagement of personnel in a hostile location without positive identification of combatant status, was creating outcomes that military leaders found concerning. But these recommendations were never implemented. The classified report was filed, the recommendations were noted, but the actual practices in the field did not change significantly. Operations continued to be planned based on probabilistic assessments of target locations. Rules of engagement continued to permit engagement of personnel in target locations without positive identification of hostile intent. The model that had generated the outcomes on page 12 of the Pentagon report continued to be the model employed in counterinsurgency operations. What happened instead was that the classification of page 12 was elevated. What had originally been classified at the secret level was reclassified to a higher level. Access was restricted. The document was moved into a more secure filing system. The recommendations made in the classified sections of the report were distributed to a small group of senior leaders, but they were not distributed to the operational commanders who would need to implement them. The report, in effect, became not a guide for future operations, but a historical document locked away from the people who could have used it to change how operations were conducted. The major who had raised the initial question about target engagement protocols during the planning session was, approximately 18 months later, relieved of his duties by the task force commanding general. The stated reason was unsuitability for command. The actual reason, according to officers who were present at the time, was that the major had continued to question the targeting methodologies being employed in subsequent operations. He had argued that the intelligence assessments being used to justify targeting decisions were not meeting a sufficient standard of verification. He had recommended that operations be postponed pending additional intelligence collection. He had, in essence, become an obstacle to the execution of the operational tempo that senior commanders believed was necessary to defeat the Taliban. The major left Afghanistan in the summer of 2009. He was assigned to a desk job at the Pentagon. His career never recovered. By 2012, he had left the military. He left without the rank promotion that officers at his level typically received. He left without the post-military consulting contracts that typically went to officers who had commanded at his level. He left with a reputation as someone who was difficult to work with, who did not understand the demands of counterinsurgency operations, who was overly focused on legal and humanitarian concerns at the expense of military effectiveness. The operation itself became one of dozens of similar operations conducted in Afghanistan and Iraq. The specific outcomes, 13 dead, 2 confirmed combatants, 11 of uncertain status, became a statistical line in monthly casualty reports. The compound was repurposed. Some elements of the Taliban cell network continued to operate. Some elements were destroyed. The strategic situation in Helmand province remained basically unchanged. No significant territorial gains were achieved. No major change in the security situation resulted from the operation. What remained significant about the operation was that it had generated a Pentagon report that classified at page 12 a recognition that something in the counterinsurgency model was problematic, that something about the combination of probabilistic targeting, incomplete intelligence, and expansive rules of engagement was creating outcomes that merited concern. That the people conducting the operations might want to change how things were being done. But what also remained significant was that this recognition, once classified, was effectively removed from the operational environment. The people who could have changed how operations were being conducted were not told what the classified assessment had concluded. The commanders in the field continued to operate based on the same operational model that had generated the outcomes that had concerned enough people to justify a 52-page classified report. Years later, when the major who had raised the initial question began writing about his experiences in Afghanistan, he was careful never to mention the specific operation. He was careful never to identify the location or the specific date. He was careful never to violate the classification restrictions that applied to the Pentagon report. But he wrote repeatedly about the problem of operating in an environment where intelligence assessments provide probability rather than certainty, where rules of engagement permit engagement without positive identification of hostile intent, where the pressure to maintain operational tempo creates incentive structures that discourage questioning the targeting methodologies being employed. He wrote, "In counterinsurgency, you are often operating with incomplete information. You must make decisions based on what you know is probably true, not what you know is certainly true. The problem is that probably is not the same as actually, and the difference between those two things can be measured in lives." When you combine probabilistic targeting with rules of engagement that permit engagement without positive identification of hostile intent, and when you layer on top of that the operational pressure to maintain high operational tempo, you create an environment where the probability of error increases substantially. What I tried to do was to ask the question, what do we do when we discover that our errors have killed people who were probably not hostile? The answer, in my experience, is that we file a classified report, and then we continue doing what we were doing. The Pentagon report sat in classified storage for 8 years. In 2016, following a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a journalist investigating civilian casualties in counterinsurgency operations, the Pentagon released a redacted version of the report. 47 pages of the original 52-page document were released. Page 12 remained classified. The cover sheet of the released document noted that information had been classified to protect operational security and to protect individuals who had provided information to military intelligence. When asked why page 12 specifically remained classified, the Pentagon stated that it contained information that could compromise intelligence collection methods. This statement was technically accurate, but it was also somewhat misleading. Page 12 did not contain particularly sensitive information about intelligence collection methods. Page 12 contained information about what the intelligence assessment had actually concluded regarding the certainty of the targeting decision. It contained assessment of the fact that the targeting decision had been based on a probability rather than a certainty. It contained recommendations that the rules of engagement be modified to require additional verification before engagement in situations where doubt existed about the status of personnel in target locations. What the Pentagon was really protecting was not operational security, but operational practice. What the Pentagon was really protecting was the right to continue operating in the way that had been operating, with the targeting methodologies that were being employed without having to justify those methodologies to a broader audience. The Major, in 2017, published a book about his experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was published by a small academic press focused on military affairs and received limited circulation beyond academic and military circles. In the book, he never mentioned Operation Exalt specifically. He never mentioned the Pentagon report by name or location. He did not identify specific operations or specific locations, but he described the broader problem in language that was recognizable to anyone who had access to the classified sections of the report. He addressed the fundamental question that page 12 had raised. He wrote, "The classified sections of military reports often contain recognitions that operational policies need to change, but classification prevents those recognitions from reaching the people who could actually implement change. Instead, the classified report becomes a way to acknowledge a problem while preventing that acknowledgement from having any operational effect. The problem is documented, the problem is studied, the problem is noted by senior leaders, and then the problem is locked away behind classification restrictions, where it cannot influence operational decisions, where it cannot change how things are actually done on the ground, where it cannot reach the commanders planning the next operation, where it cannot reach the operators executing the next operation. This is a strange form of accountability, where we acknowledge our errors in classified documents while maintaining the practices that generated those errors, where we file reports saying that something is wrong and then continue doing the same thing. What remains remarkable about the Pentagon report is not that it was filed. Military organizations are capable of conducting self-assessment. What remains remarkable is that the assessment, once filed, had no operational effect. The operation was found to be legal. The operation was found to be properly planned and properly executed. The operation was found to have resulted in outcomes that merited concern. And the response to all of this was not to change how operations were being conducted. The response was to classify the concerns at a higher level and to continue operating in the same way. Decades later, the operation would be mentioned in one sentence in a historical overview of special operations in Afghanistan. The sentence would note that the operation resulted in 13 deaths, with 2 confirmed as Taliban cell leaders. The sentence would not mention that 52 pages of classified analysis had concluded that the intelligence assessment upon which the targeting decision had been based was probabilistic rather than certain. The sentence would not mention that the Pentagon had identified concerns about the rules of engagement being employed. The sentence would not mention page 12, and it would certainly not mention the major who had asked a simple question during the planning session and whose career had been effectively ended by his determination to continue raising that question through the chain of command. The story of the operation is the story of a question that was asked, that was classified, that was buried in layers of secrecy, and that was ultimately erased from the record because erasing the question was easier than answering it in a way that might have required changing operational practices that were believed to be militarily necessary. The classified page of a classified report became not a guide for change, but evidence of institutional unwillingness to implement change.